Melanie Carter needed a change. Her divorce had left her shattered. She yearned for a new beginning, a place to heal. She wanted to leave the past behind. One afternoon she stumbled upon a listing. It was a penthouse on Blackwood Avenue, available at an unbelievable price. It seemed too good to be true, a sign from the universe. Could this be her sanctuary? Melanie decided to trust her instincts. She signed the lease that very day. The penthouse was spacious, with huge windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to start over. Little did she know, a darkness lingered within those walls, a darkness that would soon threaten to consume her. The moving truck rumbled to a stop, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness of the night. As the movers unloaded Melanie's belongings, she couldn't shake off a strange feeling. It was as if the shadows themselves were watching her every move, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. The air felt heavy, filled with an unseen presence that seemed to cling to her skin. The fog outside only added to the eerie atmosphere, making everything feel surreal. Ignoring the goosebumps on her arms, she told herself it was just the stress of moving, but deep down she knew it was more than that. There was something about this place that unsettled her. The penthouse was even more magnificent up close, its grandeur almost overwhelming. The building stood tall and imposing, a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded it. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the spacious living area. The light brought a temporary sense of warmth and comfort, but it was fleeting. The balcony promised breathtaking sunsets, a view that could make anyone forget their worries, if only for a moment. Melanie hoped it would be her sanctuary. For a moment, Melanie allowed herself to believe in a brighter future. She smiled, trying to hold on to that fleeting hope, even as the shadows seemed to whisper otherwise. But the shadows seemed to linger, even in the daylight. They moved with a life of their own, casting doubt on her newfound optimism. There was an echo to her footsteps, a coldness that seeped from the walls. It was as if the very essence of the penthouse was trying to communicate with her, to warn her. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Each tick seemed louder than the last, a constant reminder of the passage of time. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the room, the feeling of unease intensified. The shadows stretched and twisted, creating shapes that played tricks on her mind. Melanie tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, a seed of doubt had been sown. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that the penthouse held secrets she was not yet ready to uncover. The first night in the penthouse was the hardest. The silence, once unsettling, was now filled with strange noises. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows sent shivers down her spine. She tried to read a book, to distract herself, but the words swam before her eyes. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt a presence in the room with her, a coldness that sent chills down her spine. Melanie tossed and turned, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was just the stress, the unfamiliarity of the new place, but deep down, a primal fear was taking root. Something was wrong in the penthouse on Blackwood Avenue. Melanie could feel it in her bones. The whispers started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. At first, Melanie dismissed them as the wind whistling through the old window frames, a common occurrence in the aging penthouse. But as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, almost as if they were trying to communicate something urgent. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, whispering her name. Melanie. Melanie. The sound was eerie, almost otherworldly. The voice was soft, almost a sigh, yet it sent a chill down her spine. It was as if the very air around her was alive with unseen presences. It felt ancient, filled with a deep sorrow that seemed to seep into the very walls of the penthouse. The history of the place seemed to come alive in those whispers. She couldn't make out any distinct words, just the murmur of her name repeated over and over again. It was maddening, like a broken record stuck on a single haunting note. Panicked, Melanie switched on all the lights, but the whispers continued, swirling around her like a malevolent wind. The light did nothing to dispel the darkness that seemed to cling to her. It was as if the penthouse itself was speaking, warning her of an unseen danger. The very structure seemed to pulse with a life of its own. That night, Melanie barely slept. Every creak, every rustle seemed amplified, feeding her growing sense of dread. She lay in bed, listening to the whispers, her eyes wide with fear. The darkness seemed to press in on her, suffocating and relentless. She knew then that she wasn't alone in the penthouse on Blackwood Avenue. The whispers were a constant reminder of the unseen presence that shared her space. Desperate for answers, Melanie sought out the building's old doorman, Mr. Grayson. She had heard whispers about his knowledge of the building's dark past and hoped he could shed some light on the strange occurrences she had been experiencing. He had been there for decades, a silent observer to the penthouse's many tenants. His presence was a constant, a fixture in the ever-changing landscape of the building. His eyes, filled with a knowing sadness, hinted at a story he was reluctant to tell. It was as if the weight of the building's history rested heavily on his shoulders. When Melanie mentioned the strange occurrences, Mr. Grayson sighed deeply, his breath visible in the cold night air. He confirmed her fears, revealing a chilling truth. The penthouse was not just a place of luxury, it was a place of torment. The penthouse held a dark history. It was a place where the walls seemed to whisper secrets, and shadows moved of their own accord. Previous occupants had spoken of similar experiences. They had all felt the same eerie presence, the same inexplicable cold spots, whispers, cold spots, and a feeling of being watched. These were not just figments of imagination, but shared experiences that spanned decades. He spoke of a couple who lived there years ago. Their love story was the most tragic of all. They had been madly in love, but their happiness was short-lived. The penthouse seemed to feed on their joy, turning it into despair. One night the husband found his wife standing on the balcony railing, a vacant look in her eyes. It was as if she was in a trance, drawn to the edge by an unseen force. Before he could reach her, she jumped. Her fall was swift, and her life ended in an instant. Mr. Grayson's words echoed in Melanie's ears. The story was more than just a tale. It was a warning. The penthouse wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. A place where the past refused to let go, a place where love and hope went to die. It was a vortex of sorrow, pulling in all who dared to reside there. She was trapped in a nightmare, and she didn't know how to escape. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. That night, Melanie's fear reached its peak. As she sat huddled on the sofa, clutching a blanket for comfort, she saw her. A ghostly figure, transparent and ethereal, drifted past the hallway leading to the balcony. The woman was dressed in a flowing white gown, her long dark hair cascading down her back. Her face was pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through Melanie. She moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She sat, frozen in terror, her eyes fixed on the ghostly apparition as it vanished into the darkness of the balcony. The woman in white was a haunting reminder of Mr. Grayson's story. The previous tenant, driven to despair within these very walls. Now, Melanie feared she was destined to share the same fate. Sleep was impossible. Every time Melanie closed her eyes, she saw the ghostly woman in white. Her pale face and hollow eyes burned into her memory. Exhaustion gnawed at her, but fear was a stronger force. She found herself drawn to the balcony, the same place where the previous tenant had met her tragic end. Stepping outside, the cool night air did little to ease the suffocating dread that clung to her. As she gazed at her reflection in the glass door, her heart leapt into her throat. It wasn't her own reflection staring back. Superimposed over her own image was the ghostly woman, her pale hand reaching out from the reflection, a sinister smile twisting her lips. The ghostly voice whispered again, this time inside her head. "Jump," it urged. "Join me. Find peace." Melanie didn't wait to see what happened next. She didn't pack, didn't grab anything except her purse and phone. Driven by pure primal terror, she fled the penthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She raced down the seemingly endless corridors of the building, the ghostly whispers echoing behind her. The elevator couldn't come fast enough. When she finally burst out onto the street, she didn't look back. Melanie hailed a taxi and collapsed onto the back seat, gasping for breath. As the car sped away from Blackwood Avenue, she finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in a torrent, a release of the fear and terror that had gripped her. The penthouse on Blackwood Avenue had promised a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life. Instead, it had nearly destroyed her. Melanie never returned to Blackwood Avenue. She left everything behind, unwilling to set foot in that cursed place ever again. The experience left an indelible mark on her psyche, a constant shadow that haunted her thoughts. She moved into a small, nondescript apartment, hoping to find anonymity and peace. But the memories of Blackwood Avenue lingered. The whispers, the cold spots, the ghostly woman in white. Sometimes, when she looked in the mirror, she could almost see the ghostly hand reaching out, the sinister smile on the woman's face, and she would remember the chilling whisper, urging her to jump. Melanie knew that she would never truly escape the haunting of Blackwood Avenue. It was a part of her now, a darkness she would carry with her for the rest